Good evening. My name is Paul Holdengraber, and I'm the Director of Public Programs here at the New York Public Library, now known as Live from the New York Public Library. As you all know, my goal here at the library is to make the lions roar. Last night with Mario Batali, Bill Buford, and Anthony Bourdain, they were feasting, and I hope tonight they will be debating. Tonight is the grand finale of our season, the third event co-sponsored with the Cullman Center for Scholars and Writers here at the New York Public Library and its excellent director, Gene Strauss. We've done 3 events with them. The first one, I had the pleasure of interviewing Edmund White, who wrote a wonderful memoir. Quite interested he is in the human anatomy, particularly in the male anatomy, particularly in a small part of the male anatomy. And I had great pleasure asking Edmund White if his book is a book that one reads with one hand. Afterwards, this was one of the very few moments where he seemed bashful. After that, we did an event on eavesdropping with James Risen, the head also of the NSA, Bobby Ray Inman, Jeffrey Rosen, and Patrick Keefe, the very day that Michael Hayden had been suggested for that job. And Jeffrey Rosen very aptly instigated that conversation, and I hope in that role of instigator, hopefully not too much as a moderator, we have the excellent Michael Kinsley for this Slate debate, which this evening is co-sponsored by Slate itself and its excellent director, editor Jacob Weisberg. What a year this has been indeed. My first 504 days in New York City, and here at the New York Public Library. We had Myra Kalman last year and John Hope Franklin with President Clinton, and I had the pleasure of interviewing David Remnick a couple of weeks ago, Jonathan Miller and Rebecca Solnit talking about the notion of attention span. How do we have an attention span, which I think is not irrelevant for the conversation tonight. A debate about Google with the various people who now are suing each other. They were quite civil here at the library. We hosted a pen event with Amartya Sen, several events, and Salman Rushdie. An evening on revolution moderated by Christopher Hitchens, who sometimes writes for Slate. And the same Hitchens has been actually very helpful to me because I had the pleasure of welcoming here Tina Brown interviewing Bernard-Henri Lévy, and as you might remember, Garrison Keillor gave Bernard-Henri Lévy what I would call a not very kind review. But the Homer of Middle America, as Christopher Hitchens named Garrison Keillor, came to the rescue. In the pages of Slate, the article was wonderfully entitled Garrison Keillor Vulgarian. I highly recommend that you join our email list. You will then learn of the events we're doing next year. They're on your chair also. If you join today, you will be able to get 2 free tickets. I'm happy to say that our email list expanded from a few hundred now to a little over 10,000. Become a friend of the library, support this library. It's one of the last beacons of democracy. Books of the first 10 years of Slate, not every single piece written, but a few of the pieces written, will be on sale after the event. I recommend also that when you ask a question and require an answer, you go to the 2 mics. And in 10 years of doing this, I've come to an understanding that a question is usually something that can be asked in about 54 to 57 seconds. So I highly recommend you ask questions rather than make statements. So I hope for this not too chummy debate, we will have a wonderful time here tonight debating the issue of online media and print journalism. We have Norman Pearlstein, Jacob Weisberg, Michael Kinsley, Ariana Huffington, who I know from my days in blessed Los Angeles, and Malcolm Gladwell, who has said about Slate, I don't think I've ever gone to Slate and not been fascinated, infuriated, or simply found myself laughing out loud. So let's see how we react tonight to this evening. Welcome.
Thanks. Thanks, Paul. Well, we're very fortunate to have here 4 experts on the human anatomy to continue the library's discussion of that topic, and maybe we'll segue into Slate if we can. It was 11 years ago, actually, or approaching it, when I went out to Redmond, Washington to talk to Microsoft about starting an online magazine. And I left there with many dreams of glory, of millions of readers, of putting Time magazine and Newsweek out of business. But I certainly never dreamed that in just 10 years we'd have a symposium at the New York Public Library. So I think this is our greatest accomplishment to date, and Jacob deserves congratulations. You all know these panelists. I'm just going to say a word or two about them because I think I know them better than some people here. If you'd asked anyone in the circle of the New Republic, say 20 years ago, who in that crowd was most likely to become a revered and fabulously wealthy guru for businessmen all over the world, you would have obviously said Malcolm. And that is because, little known, it says here that he's a staff writer with the New Yorker and he was a reporter for the Washington Post. Before that, he was a reporter for the Washington Times. And we all assumed he must be a Moonie. And now, of course, he is Reverend Moon to a large part of the American business establishment. So we're very glad to have him here. I've known Ariana since she was a liberal the last time. And she has had many accomplishments, written many books. I somehow think these books might be about you, or at least I was working on that theory. The Making of a Legend, Creator and Destroyer, but then I looked at the others and decided that theory doesn't work. I think Ariana has done a fabulous job, miraculous really, in establishing the Huffington Post as not just a major website, but a major force in the media in this country in barely a year. And a small sign of that success was last week, I think. The New York Times had an article about some arrangement between you and the New York Observer. And the peg was, big, powerful website helps small, insignificant website. And Ariana was the big, powerful website. Jacob is editor of Slate. There's only 2 people who have had that job, and he's had it more recently. He had a very good idea in the current Slate. He has 4 critics of Slate writing. And Michael Wolff says about Jacob, he accuses Jacob of being ambitious. Now, that's not completely implausible, but I'm trying to think of a comparison that does justice to this notion of Michael Wolff calling you ambitious. And I'd say, the only thing I think of is, it's like being called ambitious by Michael Wolff. So congratulations for that. Some of the publicity for this evening went out and it said, come to a very exciting evening with Malcolm Gladwell, Ariana Huffington, Jacob Weisberg, and others. So I emailed Norm saying, I guess we're the others. And Norm has only been managing editor of the Wall Street Journal and what is it, the Emperor of Time magazines, editor-in-chief, of which there have only been 3 or 4 in the whole history. So I'm happy to be an other with Norm. And I want to start with a really tough question. Paul, I don't think this is going to be a really contentious evening, but we'll see what we can do. The subject is the future of journalism in the online media age. I don't think anyone is going to say, as people did say 10 years ago, that the internet has no future. The question I'd like to start out with is, does paper have a future? And if so, what does it look like? 10 years from now, will we be reading newspapers and magazines on paper? Norm.
On paper?
Yeah.
10 years from now, we will be reading magazines on paper, and we may be reading newspapers on paper, more because tablet technology will be slower than people anticipate than because people are wonderfully enthused about paper. And the big problem is really going to be the business model for newspapers with the clear movement of classified advertising to online. It's going to be very hard for newspapers to sustain themselves as we know them.
My theory, which I'm not entitled to toss out so early since I'm supposed to be the moderator, is that newspapers are going to lose the classifieds because they're so profitable, and they're going to lose their opinion sections because they're so unprofitable. And both of those parts are going to go online. Well, so what is the business model that's going to work for a newspaper?
Well, if you assume that the principal strengths of newspapers traditionally have been their timeliness, their being publications of record, and their allowing for a transaction through classified ads, the net does all three of those things better than a newspaper does. So I think that the most exciting thing that could happen is that newspapers and magazines become more publications of opinion, and that not unlike the national papers in Britain, if you will, they will actually be more distinctive than they are right now. I think magazines may very well go back to the kinds of publications that people like Luce started with in the 20s, much more opinionated, much more reactive to what is happening online, be it in video or in text.
Jacob, when we started Slate, you got there about 6 months or 3 months after we started, so you missed some of this embarrassment. My idea before I started was that we were once a week going to put something up on the web and then allow people to download it and print it out, and that was going to be Slate, the online magazine. We've moved far beyond that. Will there be printouts? I believe we still put out, do we, a printed version for Bill Gates Sr.?
No, I'm afraid that was a casualty of the move from Microsoft. But it is true. I mean, early on we did, I think, you conceived of Slate partly as a sort of delivery system for a magazine, and you thought, we were all bedeviled by the lead time at the New Republic, the time between when we'd finish putting out the New Republic and when subscribers would get it. And even then, a lot happened in those 5 days. Now, the idea that you're commenting, that readers are reading comments that were written almost a week ago is sort of becoming untenable. But I think the other thing that happened, and this started to happen even before I got to Slate, but certainly was in full swing by the time I got there, we discovered that the web was different. There were these properties of the medium. The tone was different, the voice was different. You could do things with linking and multimedia and interacting with readers. And that just sort of, we may have started with the idea that we were just going to take a conventional kind of weekly magazine and put it online. But we very quickly discovered that you could do all sorts of other things that were more interesting, and perforce we've been doing them. And 10 years later, it is really possible to talk about the tone of online journalism and the language or the syntax of hyperlinks. And there are all of these hallmarks to online writing that I think most people sort of instantly recognize now because they've read so much of it, which is different from what you get in a print publication.
So is it just going to be another addition to the mix? Some people say that every new medium that's come in just gets layered on top. Movies didn't die out because of television, and so on. And so the paper magazines won't die out because of online magazines. Do you buy that?
I don't think they'll die out. I mean, people have always wanted to set up this sort of competition. Will we kill them? I mean, I don't, you said you wanted to put the news magazines out of business. I don't particularly want to put anybody out of business.
No, I didn't want to, but I thought that might be a tragic side aspect of
well, if a tragic
success.
fate like that befell us, it still wouldn't be. It would still be a notch in our belt. But
I understand that since your offices are in with Newsweek, you don't want to go around saying your goal is to destroy.
Well, there's one news magazine we definitely don't want to put out of business. Yeah. But the point is, will people still be reading newspapers that are printed on newspapers? Yes. Do people still listen to music on stereos? Yes. But there are these transformational moments, and when the iPod came along, suddenly the way that many people we know consumed music changed, and it changed very quickly. And you used to have this line, which I would quote a lot, you had said, I hope this won't embarrass you, but early on that Slate would really succeed when you could read it on the John. When there was a way to read it on a portable device. And I think we've had all sorts of things have developed out of Slate and internet magazines, and all sorts of things work, but we're still waiting for the iPod of reading. We're still waiting for a device that is a comfortable way for people to read books, to read magazines, to read everything they read. And that, people are managing to read them on Blackberries and on tablet PCs.
You get it on the iPod, in fact.
Yes, in fact, Andy Bowers, who is a very tech-savvy person on our staff, figured that you could download Slate, and prompting us to realize that the iPod of reading might be the iPod. But in fact, it's still a little screen, and you wouldn't want to read War and Peace on an iPod. But sometime in the next several years, there's going to be a device like that. And that, I think, is going to be the real threat to the printed form of all sorts of publications.
Well, I've been saying that now for 10 years, and I'm astonished it hasn't happened yet. We don't really have anyone on this panel qualified to say. I was wondering if Andy's here, Andy Bowers. Do you have a theory, Andy? Well, I'll introduce you while you get to one. Andy Bowers is Slate's ambassador to NPR
and a multimedia editor.
Multimedia editor.
Well, I do. Yes, we have recently introduced one of our most popular Slate features, Today's Papers, as a text cast, we're calling it, which you can download like a podcast onto your iPod. And in fact, I did read on a blog the other day someone saying, you know what you can do? You can take it in the John. So maybe we have reached that point, but it is not ideal. I think that the iPod itself may get a larger screen. We've seen some indications of that. The great thing about the iPod when it comes to this is that it has achieved a kind of market penetration that no e-book reader ever has. So if we move at it from that point of view, where we start with music, move on to text, it's conceivable, but I think it is still a few years away.
Well, go ahead, Malcolm.
Good. Suppose we reverse things, and all we had were computers and iPods, and we didn't have paper. And I came along and I said, I've got this really great idea, which is we're going to print this stuff on this thing called paper. Now, you've never heard about it, but it has some real advantages. It's incredibly cheap. It's really light. You can stick it in your bag. You can take it with you. It doesn't need any electricity. It's pretty permanent. You can manipulate it. It's tactile. You can fold it. You can do all these amazing things. What would people say? They would say, oh my goodness, what an extraordinary breakthrough. And there would be a whole industry that would develop overnight with masses of funding from venture capitalists on the West Coast. Because actually there would be venture capitalists on the East Coast who were suddenly enthused with this extraordinary thing called paper. And we realized, you know what? Oh my goodness, we can send it through the mail really quickly and cheaply. It didn't cost that much, like 17 cents. We can send it, It strikes me, we're just in this kind of, we're in love with, when I hear about these increasingly complex ways of a tablet that'll weigh like, 7.8 pounds or whatever, and I can plug it into the wall in the bathroom so I can read on the John. Why? I can just get a newspaper. I mean, am I crazy?
You buy that, Ariana?
I think Malcolm is absolutely right. I find this debate between online and print, who is going to survive, who is going to die, incredibly old-fashioned, irrelevant. I don't think there is a debate. I think it's not either or. It's like the old barroom argument, is it Ginger or Marianne? This is 2006, let's have a three-way. We don't have to choose. I mean, I have a 17-year-old daughter who does practically everything online, including watching Desperate Housewives online. So she has a perfectly good plasma TV in her room. And I ask her about it, and she prefers that experience. But at the same time, she subscribes to 6 or 7 magazines. And when I offered her the choice of interning at the Huffington Post or calling my friend Jake and getting her an internship at Slate for the summer, she said, no, Mom, I'd rather intern at Vanity Fair, which is where she's going to intern. So,
does she read newspapers?
She reads newspapers, yes.
And on paper?
On paper.
She's the one, huh?
The last reader.
The last reader. So I really think that Malcolm has it absolutely right. There is a different experience, and we need both. It's like having quick stolen moments in a relationship and then going away for a 2-week vacation. You need both. And when you go on a plane with like 6 or 7 magazines, it's a different experience that we all relish, and it doesn't detract from reading Slate online.
Well, it's I used to get stories every once in a while where I would look at them and say, interesting if true. And that's frankly what I feel about Malcolm's assertion, because the focus is all on the idea of, and the romanticism of print, but it's a very tough sell to the advertisers. And I think if you actually did the numbers on the business model, the suggestion would fade away pretty quickly. It is a very expensive way to try to distribute. And the problem really isn't so much that people are tired of newspapers. There's a very large number of people who want to read them. The problem is that advertisers who thought that newspapers were a great way to reach audiences have discovered search. And database marketing is a far more efficient way to operate. And I think that's what's going to kill the business model, because without the advertising, the newspapers are not going to be able to charge enough to maintain the kind of staffs that will make it a compelling read.
But
And I think that's as big a problem for Slate, frankly, as it is for print. And that, if you will, people will be spending their time with video and not really spending that much time with either of us, so far as the advertiser is concerned.
I would draw a distinction among kinds of print. I mean, Malcolm, when it comes to books, I think you're absolutely right. The printed book is still appropriate technology. If you choose one way to read a book, I mean, I like audiobooks and have even played digital books, but if you had to choose one way to read a book, it would be a book. But newspapers, no way. Would we invent newspapers if they didn't exist? No way. It's not a good way to navigate the news. You have to wade through all sorts of stuff you're not interested in. It comes off on your hands. It has to be recycled. If people under 30 years old find them sort of inconceivable objects, I mean, it's just, they'll be around for a while. And magazines are probably more like books. The best way to read Vanity Fair, I'll leave aside the New Yorker question, but Vanity's the best way to read a magazine, but then that may change, and it's probably going to take longest for books to change. It all may change. But right now, I don't think you would create a newspaper.
Let's talk about the business model. First of all, right now, advertising dollars online are only 5% of all advertising dollars. I just came back this afternoon from the advertising convention in Cannes, and they're all looking at how to change the nature of advertising in every medium, how to make it more compelling so that it doesn't feel like it interrupts the content, but it becomes part of the content. And that's a battle that they're going to be facing, whatever the medium is, because you have TiVo, because you people don't have the same kind of patience with 30-second ads on TV. So the advertising industry is changing anyway, and the online dollars are not yet where we want them to be, those of us online, and there is still a lot of resistance, I'm sure you're finding that, from advertisers who don't understand the nature of online. So it depends on how long is our view of all these things. There are still millions of people who never go online. So during our lifetime, there's no question, all these media are going to exist, and the ones that thrive are the ones that integrate online technologies. I mean, look at the New York Times. I mean, how idiotic is it to put their best content behind walls? I mean, there is no question that unless you're peddling porn, and especially weird porn, you should not ask people to pay for it.
Well, then why are you defending Malcolm, who says that people will be happy to pay for a newspaper? I mean, that was a wall. That was wasn't it?
No, but first of all, people have habits of buying newspapers, which they don't have when it comes to buying for Maureen Dowd online. Because either they're going to read her in the newspaper, or they're going to go read Jake, or read the Huffington Post, or read other things online. It's just different modes of getting your information. We're not going to change them overnight.
Well, about 10 years ago, I was doing a panel like this one, and one of these millions of people who still aren't online raised her hand and said, I love reading Slate, but I don't like reading on a computer screen. And that was probably the comment I got the most for the first 3 or 4 years. And I launched into a talk very much like what Norm was saying, what Jacob was saying about how devices are going to come along and the tablet is due any minute. and in 6 months, paper will be a distant memory. And it all sounded a little lame until this, I was cut off by this computer professor from Rice, I don't even know his name now, who said to this woman and me, your problem will be solved actuarially. And I think that's pretty much come to pass. I mean, 10 years later, what is the average age of a person who has sort of grown up using a computer screen? It's in their 30s now, right? and 10 years from now it'll be in their 40s, and that's basically a majority of the population. And for them, the idea of a newspaper is just going to seem very foreign, no?
But also those of us who are over 30 are living longer. So we're still going to be around. We're still going to be around enjoying print. And you know, I speak as somebody who wants more and more people to go online, but I don't think it's going to change the nature of print as dramatically as we think.
But I don't know, if I can ask you a question, what do you think the New York Times should do? They're trying to sell print subscriptions to the newspaper, which I think costs something like $660 a year. And they're giving away the same product online. And in fact, or at least they were until Time Select, and in fact, for most younger people, what they give away is significantly superior to what they're trying to sell for all that money. And when they sit around in their meetings, I think they think, well, how are we going to keep people paying for this? And I guess my feeling is they create another set of problems, partly because you say the political conversation in particular has moved online, and if you're behind a subscription wall, you cut yourself off from it. On the other hand, I think it's in all of our interests, it's in the interests of democracy for the New York Times to find a way to support its business, to support its very expensive newsroom and foreign bureaus. And if they can't charge for any of their content, what are they supposed to do?
Well, they can use their online operation through advertising to subsidize print, if it comes to that. But at the moment, we all know the power of linking, right? I mean, that's the great thing. It's not a zero-sum game. Like Sunday, Frank Rich had a great column taking on the Democratic Party's spinelessness on Iraq. We wanted to link to it from the Huffington Post. We couldn't. So the kind of linking that can drive traffic to the New York Times, that would increase their numbers, that would increase the amount of advertising they can sell, is the business model of the future. But, you know, expect Pinch Sulzberger to actually get to it. I mean, he couldn't even fire Judy Miller for years. So, you know, it's going to take a long time before they wake up to the current realities.
One odd thing about newspaper economics is that that $660 you mentioned, Jacob, doesn't even cover the cost of the paper. So you're getting more than $660 worth of newsprint. And not everyone may be as delighted about that as Malcolm is. So it does seem as if there ought to be some way you can eliminate the paper. If you could go to each reader and say, if you'll read it online, I'll give it to you for free, and somehow or other keep the advertising, that would work.
This is all very reminiscent of a debate that started about 20 years before the internet explosion about the paperless office. Right. With the advent of computers were supposed to replace the use of paper in the business context. And you can go back and you will find endless people writing long articles about the impending advent of the paperless office. Now, the paperless office, not only does it not happen, the opposite happens. That with the introduction of electronic tools into the workplace, the amount of paper that is consumed by the average office starts to increase. And it has gone up and up and up and up and up and up and up. So clearly what's happening, there are many things wonderful things that happen with the advent of the computerization of, intellectual activity. But clearly one of the things that is not happening is the replacement of paper. Paper, far from being an opponent of electronic media, appears to be its friend. Now, and I don't pretend to understand this, but but if you were an anthropologist and you went and you sat in the middle of any office in the United States, you would see people consuming more and more and more paper. I get more mail now than I ever did 10 years ago. When I go to my office, I can't even get into my office at the New Yorker.
You weren't Malcolm Gladwell 10 years ago.
It's not a function of me, it's a function of the world that I live in. We all live in. People are sending us more stuff, right? Now, this is paradoxical. We're all talking about paper as this kind of primitive, 19th century device, but I see more of it around now than I've ever seen before. We're all talking about these kids who, for them, the online experience is everything. But as far as I can see, to reach kids, what are we doing? We're sending them pieces of paper, either in the mail or on newsstands, or we're handing them pieces of paper on the street. Why isn't paper disappearing?
Sure.
But,
I don't know why I'm looking at you, by the way. I'm looking at you.
But, for me, a kind of more interesting debate is what's going to happen to newspapers' content. How is the online experience going to change the content of newspapers? And I think there are two things happening online, and Jake touched on one of them, that are going to gradually begin to change the content of newspapers. One is that the readers whether they're online or reading print, are expecting different things. They want to be more engaged. They want to be more involved. They're getting used to a more interactive experience. That's number one. And number two, there is something about the obsessiveness of the online experience, the way we stay on stories and stay on stories until we break through the static, which you don't get in print. I mean, look at the number of stories that die on the front page above the fold of the New York Times. You know, they cover them and then they abandon them. I mean, do you remember the Phil Cooney story? You know, who was kind of doctoring global warming research. It was above the fold in the New York Times. And then it was the bloggers who took it on and found out who he was, his connections with ExxonMobil, who stayed on the story until basically he had to resign. So in order to get some kind of action, you have to go online. The obsessiveness, the kind of online has OCD and print has ADD. And maybe together we can be crazy effective, but you need both. And more readers are expecting that kind of obsessiveness and loving it. I mean, when I was writing columns, and I still am, but it's not my primary mode of living, I would get my editors constantly saying, you know, you wrote about the drug war last month. Are you writing about it again? It could never happen online. Readers love that you are staying on a story and staying on it again and again.
Well, one of the conventions of newspapers, and Slate, we pride ourselves on ignoring a lot of them, but one of the conventions is that you have to have something new to put the story in the paper again. And bloggers, of course, don't feel that way. They can incubate the story like a hen sitting on an egg, because they'll just keep hammering at the same information or finding a new way to put it or sort of ratchet up the rhetoric. But they don't need anything new to happen. They can just keep proclaiming their outrage. And in fact, in a couple key cases, I mean, Strom Thurmond, Trent Lott saying nice things about Strom Thurmond and losing his job. They didn't bring Strom Thurmond back to life. That was impossible. And Dan Rather, they had a big effect, not primarily because they brought new information, but because they kind of kept it warm until the rest of the media would come back to it.
Yeah, well, but to take your I can't remember, I guess it was Jacob's metaphor of the chicken sitting on the egg. The New York Times was the rooster. In other words, don't you need newspapers to start the thing going? The online people don't do these stories themselves. Don't you need newspapers?
Absolutely. I mean, you're making Malcolm and my point. You do need newspapers so that you can criticize them and move beyond them. You do need newspapers. Listen,
Warren says you're going to put them out of business.
Well, I'm saying that I don't think, frankly, online editorial products are what's going to put newspapers out of business. I think search is going to be so appealing to advertisers that it's going to be very hard, especially for timely publications, to compete. Look, somebody correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that the Washington Post Company last year got 65% of its net income from Kaplan Educational Services, not from the Washington Post, Newsweek, or Slate. The Financial Times and the Wall Street Journal are basically at break even. The San Francisco Chronicle has been decimated by Craigslist, which is hardly focused on maximization of profits. And those are the kinds of pressures that are really going to affect publicly held companies who own most of the large urban newspapers in this country. And that's where I think, if you will, the second step will be that the kind of things that you're seeing at Tribune Company, which you know so well, is that the response to that is going to be to come in and hack budgets and say, why do we have 20 film reviewers at 20 newspapers when we could have one and syndicated for all? Why can't we mush all these papers' Washington bureaus together? And
why don't we just print the press releases from the movie companies and review all together?
Cheapest way of all, best way to. So that's what I think will lead, if you will, to the degradation of print, and what will then make people increasingly turn to online. And I think that what you did say, and is probably appropriate for this room, is that increasingly an awful lot of what passed for big, important public service stories in newspapers will end up in books first. Ron Suskind this week, was a great excerpt for Time, but it began as a book.
Actually, I think the reason why what Norm is describing isn't going to happen is because there are always going to be enough rich people who want to own newspapers as the ultimate kind of possession. Instead of spending $40 million to buy a Picasso, You spend $1 billion if you have it to buy the LA Times or to buy the New York Times if the Sulzbergers would ever sell. Whatever it is, there will always be enough rich people. There are more and more of them for some reason who have more and more money. And what is the ultimate thing that you can own? A newspaper.
Well,
because
but you're living in the past if you think that.
But it's happening. What do you mean? I'm not living. Look at all the number of people competing for the LA Times right now. And it would be more than $1 billion that they would have to spend. And yet there they are. They are ready to buy it. And do you have any doubt that if the New York Times went on the block, there wouldn't be enough rich people fighting with each other to buy it? The ultimate status symbol. There will always be
well, it
the
is
ultimate
now. It
status
is now.
symbol.
But if the question is, when these people get bored with it and want to sell it to the next one, which is the way a magazine like the New Republic works, but on a much smaller scale. Is there going to be someone 20 years from now who's going to find the privilege of owning a newspaper to be the ultimate status symbol?
There will always be people who think that buying a Rembrandt or a Picasso is an ultimate status symbol. That hasn't changed. I mean, they haven't said we'll go watch.
One thing is about a Rembrandt or a Picasso is you put it on the wall and you have to pay a bit of insurance, but it doesn't. It's not the gift that keeps on charging like a newspaper.
Mike, I mean, I think we all have a stake in newspapers, the news gathering operation of newspapers surviving and thriving in whatever form, and there's clearly a transition problem now where the cost of the good newsrooms is very high, the revenues from print are shrinking, and the revenues from online are growing fast, but from a smaller base, so it's hard to see exactly how you come out to the other end and support the newsroom. But one thing I think newspapers could do better, and a reason that I've been very disappointed with newspapers online, is I think that while they've embraced the internet as sort of a business necessity, they have not, for the most part, embraced it as a creative opportunity. And when you look at most newspaper writers, they actually have a much bigger audience online, often a national audience where they would only have a local audience, for example, Washington Post, LA Times. But they still focus on their print audience. And you go online, including New York Times, and stories don't have hyperlinks. They're written with the same newspaper conventions. And the writers are not, sometimes there's some interaction with readers, but it still tends to be fairly perfunctory and minimal. And they're not embracing what you can do on the internet. And I think they've sort of got the formula backwards. I think they should write for the web audience and then figure out how to repurpose the content for the print newspaper.
Well, this is a very small point, but is part of the problem geographical? I mean, they have different staffs at the Washington Post, for example, and at WPNI, which runs the website. At the Los Angeles Times, the web operation was sort of often an unused wing of the old Times Mirror building, of which there were many. And they think of them mentally as separate products. And is that the...
There have been a lot of permutations of this. I mean, the New York Times has now reintegrated its newsroom. At the Washington Post, they're separate. You can look at pretty much every way of doing this. But the problem is that most of the content of newspapers online is written by people who are trained as print reporters, and nobody has convincingly said to them, your future as a journalist depends on how well you can write things that are going to be primarily read online. And in fact, it won't do any harm to what you do in print, but what happened to all the links you put in you used when you were researching the story?
Well, maybe that's a problem that will be solved demographically too.
But it's beyond the links, it's also the tone. In this great piece that Jake wrote about the 10th anniversary of Slate, you said about how readers know the writers of Slate much more intimately, much better than they know any writers of the New York Times. Like they know David Potts and Jack Schaefer and Mickey Kausen, all the writers of Slate, because of the kind of intimate tone that they bring to it. They reveal more of themselves. That's part of what works online. And unless you are more endowed, or Frank Rich to some extent, the writers of the New York Times, especially the reporters, do not reveal anything of themselves. That is part of the tone that the New York Times wants. And readers like that much more personal, much more intimate tone. So if you're going to have a real online operation, you can't use the same people unless they can swim in those different waters. I was talking to Chris DeWolf, who's the co-founder of MySpace, and he said that everybody in his operation wanted him to fire Tom, because Tom, who is the man who made MySpace, was a different kind of animal. He said he would walk in at 10:30 and he didn't have the same kind of discipline. He didn't operate by the same rules. And I said to them, I'm going to have him report to me. He can come in at midday. I don't care. He understands something we need to understand. So print need to actually start thinking like that. They need to find the people who can swim in the new waters, who can understand the new world. And then their online operations can really thrive and even sustain print.
You looking at me?
Yes.
When people talk about newspapers, I always think of the airline industry. Because if you think about the airline industry, it's this weird thing, and someone should make up a word to describe this phenomenon, which is that the airline itself never makes any money, right? They always lose money. Everybody else connected with flying makes money. So Boeing makes tons of money to sell them the airplanes. The pilots make a ton of money to fly them. Passengers get really, really cheap fares. Hotels make out, like bandits, with people flying, to Vegas, and everyone in Vegas makes a ton of money. Everyone makes money except for the core person who actually does the work of moving people around the country, right? So this is this phenomenon where it's like the hollowed-out center. The guy at the center who does all the work gets no money, and everyone else who's basically a little parasite living off the guy at the center makes tons of money. This is the newspaper business, right? Without the New York Times, there is no blog community, right? They
have nothing to talk about.
They have nothing to blog about, right? They read the New York Times in the morning, and then they go write the little thing. Now, take away the New York Times, what are they going to do, right? Get jobs? I don't know. I have no idea. So the solution to the problem is not to say, oh, I guess newspapers are dead and we have to work. Well, no, because the whole system crashes down. It's like saying,
well, why hasn't that happened in the airlines?
If airlines can't make money, maybe we just shouldn't have airlines. Well, I think the answer is to try and fix the airlines. Airlines have got to be a little bit better at pricing their services appropriately, right?
Well,
so should newspapers.
Ariana says the appropriate price of news is zero.
I think that's wrong. I, like many people in this room, pay, I don't even know what it is, some huge amount of money to HBO every month, right? Now, the appropriate price for, and how much HBO do I watch? I watch Entourage on Sunday nights. So for whatever it is, a month, $40, I don't know, one lousy show, right? Why do I do that? And why do, not just me, millions of Americans do this. Why do we do this? Well, because we have decided that having access to this cache of premium content is worth something. And HBO has been aggressive in saying, you know what, I'm not giving it to you for free. I'm going to make you pay for it.
Well,
it's time that people, not just newspapers, but everyone in the print game who are providing the carcass, which all of these little small animals are picking over, it's time for them to sort of appropriately price their
okay, as a very small animal, feeding off the carcass, can I kind of say that this is a completely upside-down way of looking at things? Because all that the New York Times or the Washington Post or any major newspaper brings to the table is the massive resources they have to do investigative reporting that blogs don't yet have, but we're working on it. As more and more advertising moves online, we're going to be hiring investigative reporters. I know this is the next part of our expansion at the Huffington Post is hiring investigative reporters. George Marshall is already doing it. It's going to take a few years to get to the point where we can have bureaus or reporters everywhere. But obviously that's the future. It's not going to stop with print because it's only a matter of money. They have way more money than we have, and that's why we feed off them, because they write those investigative stories that then we can analyze and pick apart and take them to the next stage. And Jake, actually, I must disagree with one thing you said. I don't think we just sit on the egg. I think we actually bring new pieces to the nest, and somebody else will write about the same story and bring another piece of information. What happened with the Trent Lott story was that they kept developing it. Bloggers kept finding things in his past that corroborated his racist statement at the lunch. So it was really a story that kept getting bigger and bigger and bigger because more and more people were feeding into it. And it wasn't just the reporters, not just the bloggers, it was also the readers. I mean, the community of commenters, which is absolutely amazing because they bring their own expertise and passion into the story.
But Ariana, sorry to jump in.
Yes, Malcolm.
You're contradicting yourself now. So 5 minutes ago, what was unique and special about, there was something particular about the sensibility of online, right? You're saying it's personal, it's, there's an opinion attached to it. Now you're saying, well, that sensibility will magically morph over the next couple of years with the addition of some dollars, and it will adopt the sensibility of the print world. Let me give you an example. I wrote a review, a short review for the New Yorker of a book called Wages of Wins, which is this sort of controversial book about how to value basketball players. And then I have a blog, but I have a blog that supplements the writing I do. So I wrote a little thing about this thing, and then all kinds of people wrote.
How much do you charge for your blog?
It's free. But no, bear with me. So I wrote this little thing about Wages of Wins, and then the blogosphere, reacted to the piece that I wrote and reacted to my little blogging about it. And I would periodically conduct an experiment, which was, and everyone was, I would say that the comments ran 85% negative, 15% positive. But I conducted an experiment periodically. I'd go on Google and I would bring up all the comments about this book because I wanted to see if anyone of the dozens, if not more than that, of people who were commenting online had actually read the book in question. And as far as I can tell, I remain the only person who has written about this book who's actually read it. Everyone else has merely been commenting on the comments about the book, right? And it's gotten to the point where there have been huge arguments online among people, and they are now 4 or 5 degrees removed from the actual book. Now, I'll point out to you, the book costs $21.95, and the relevant chapters comprise about 45 pages. This can be done in an hour and a half. Now, there is something about the blogosphere at the present moment, and I think online to a certain extent, which is culturally resistant to spending $21.95 for a book and reading 45 pages. Now, maybe that will magically disappear with the advent of sprinkling of cash. I kind of doubt it. I think there's something inherent in that culture that's a problem that requires a carcass to pick on.
Well, maybe so, Malcolm.
Can I just defend that? You see, again, you are moving into this Cartesian either-or thing. We are not going to lose our intimate, personal way of writing about things. We are just going to add investigative reporting. We're just going to add people who are reading the entire book and commenting on it. Because don't tell me that every reviewer in the New York Times review of books reads every book from beginning to end. Are you going to tell me that? Are you going to claim that everybody who reviews books has actually read them from beginning to end?
Sure. I mean, it's not that hard. Have you read a book? I mean, it can be done.
I know.
I think I read one earlier this week.
Trust me, I know it's not so
I'm still
hard.
here.
Well,
I had time to get a full night's sleep.
I know it's not so hard.
I mean, you make it sound like it's climbing Mount Everest.
25 years ago, I conducted an experiment a little bit like yours, and this was on people on paper. And I just got someone to stick a little Post-it note two-thirds of the way through books on sale, bestsellers at a local bookstore in Washington, said, if you read this note, call this number and I'll give you $5. And I didn't get a single call.
Exactly.
You've always had it in for paper. But.
No, Mike is absolutely confirming my point, which is that it's not the advent of online or the people who are online who don't read books always from beginning to end. It's people reviewing them. I've had many of my books reviewed by people who hadn't read them. And I'm sure you had too, Malcolm. And that's a problem that is about human nature. It's not about online.
Right. But also, Ariana, I mean, you're a champion of blogging now, which I support. I mean, I think it's a wonderful democratic activity. It's drawn all sorts of people in the political process. It has, you will acknowledge, a lot of annoying characteristics. There is a lot online that's not blogging. And there are many areas where what you can now get online, drawn neither particularly from blogs, nor particularly from traditional newspapers, is the richest source of information, particularly in certain subject areas. I mean, if you want to know what's really going on in Syria, or probably a lot of other countries, there are a couple of websites, you could call them blogs, not really blogs, run by American academics in other countries that manage to aggregate all sorts of things. I mean, certainly blogs and newspaper stories from around the world, but leaked documents, sort of reports, institutional reports about things. I mean, if you really want to be on top of something, there's a place you find it on the internet now. But it doesn't really, it's not that you...
As you say this, of course, you realize the irony. You are...
Paper?
No, you are sitting inside of a library. Right, a place that has managed to magically aggregate documents. I love when you use that word aggregate, you pause as if it was this concept that has just been invented with Google. Magically, they have found a way to gather information from a variety of sources. And here you're sitting in the New York Public Library.
Point taken. And the New York Public Library is a wonderful place, but not everybody has access to it. Not everybody is in New York. Not everybody in the middle of the day can come over here and browse through or call things from the stacks. You can't borrow books from the New York Public Library. Sometimes it's easier to order them from Amazon. It's not that it's I mean, to Ariana's point, there's a multiplicity of ways to obtain information, and positing a direct opposition where one is going to kill the other versus supplementing the other. Someday, before too long, the New York Public Library, like the Bodleian Library at Oxford, may be entirely online. I mean, won't that be amazing? That will be a bit of a problem for the New York Public Library, maybe, because not as many people will need to actually be physically present to get what's here. But it'll be a wonderful thing because the richness of the resources here will be open to billions of people around the world.
You want to say something?
I was just going to say, I think a more critical issue, and it is heretical to mention it here, is that readers are a niche audience, whether they're online or in print. And what I think the real promise of online is going to be is video on demand, and that will have major consequences for all the things that we're talking about now. I don't think that there's a shortage of people who want to do great journalism who are actually doing it right now. You're absolutely right about the sites that you can find specialized information on. What the New Yorker did a couple of weeks ago with its dispatches from Iraq is actually available online every day for people who want to, for instance, know what is coming out of Iraq from the military, from the soldiers who are fighting it. I think the bigger question is really just going to be the allocation of resources and the allocation of time.
Well, if I understand your theory right, Norm, your theory is that rationalization is basically cutting out all sorts of cross-subsidies for information and reporting and journalism in any form, because basically, even online, it is supported by something else. And so ultimately, are we going to face the choice of either, as Malcolm says, paying for the information we get,
right,
us niche people who still want it, or going without it?
Well, I just think the business models are under extraordinary stress. I got an advertisement last week inviting me to subscribe to Vanity Fair for $12 for a year. That it probably costs something pretty close to that just to do the marketing, let alone the cost for it. So that's not a long-term business plan, because it's totally dependent on, if you will, advertisers' continued desire to be in that publication rather than to engage in database marketing.
Well, the reason they charge the $12 at all is so that they can claim to advertisers that people got this magazine and read it. But online, of course, you don't have to prove that, because you're only charging for people who actually read it.
The theories that you engaged in when you went to Slate 10 years ago, and I remember your business plan very well, talked about the fact that you wouldn't have to pay postage, you wouldn't have to pay for paper, and I just think you were early, but that's inevitably true. The only question in my mind is whether things like RSS and the ability, if you will, through the kind of interaction among your bloggers that, if you will, has information bubbling up, doesn't really take away from, if you will, the kind of reporting that you're talking about. I just think it's very hard to sustain.
We're going to start taking questions in a couple of minutes, and if you have one, just stand in front of these microphones here. I wonder if the lady there in the first row could give me a signal when we're approaching our time out at 8 o'clock.
Incidentally, the lady in the front row is one of the best things that have happened out of Slade. Because it is Michael's wife, Patty, and they met, as I understand, on the first day when you went up to Seattle to deal with your project.
I should have said that one thing I never dreamed of was being in a symposium at the New York Public Library, and the other was that I would have met that day the person who became my wife. Although if I'd been told that that was happening, I would have been able to say which one it was. So, is there someone? Is there someone at that microphone? There's someone at this one. Go ahead.
My name's Alice Labrie, and I'm a Time Warner shareholder. Hi, Mr. Perlstein. I think you're all being a little bit elitist here, because I want to know what your comments are about AM New York and Metro New York, which is, I think, enjoying a boom. They're a free paper. They're now finally getting advertisement. And so what's the future of that kind of paper?
That's a good point. The biggest, the most immediate threat to major papers has turned out to be other papers, sometimes published by them, the same company.
Those papers are a threat to me personally, because the subway entrance is narrow, and the guy at mine manages to block it almost completely. And if you don't take a paper, he kind of shifts with you a little bit, and you pretty much have to take one. But I mean, in seriousness, it is a very good point, because I think a lot of metropolitan dailies are much more worried about the competition from free newspapers, because a lot of people seem quite satisfied with any newspaper, and one that's presented to them by hand for free. It's very hard to compete with, even if your newspaper is 100 times better.
I think that the model that of an AM, of the kind of free sheets that you're seeing, works in urban areas with large public transportation systems. It's not particularly good in most American cities where people drive to work. It does work in Europe, and it certainly has potential in Asia as well. But you know, the New York Post costs a quarter, and its circulation has held up quite well against the free sheets. The news has struggled a bit more.
How many people here read a newspaper on paper every day, or just about every day? And anyone here who doesn't? We're still a pretty good stronghold.
Well,
I'm not sure we're across
the choice of city and venue have a lot to do with it.
Yeah, you don't come to a library if you're not into paper to some extent. Ma'am.
I'm a reporter, and I'd like to know, within 5 years, who is going to pay for my expense, like if I want to go to New Orleans and report what's going on after Katrina or something like that. Who is going to pay for my plane tickets? Or
well, Ariana's
it's going to be online.
I think that more and more online websites, publications, whatever you want to call them, are going to be paying for investigative reporting. I mean, look at what happened to Slate. After all, we are here to celebrate the 10th anniversary of Slate, you know, becoming as part of the establishment media. I mean, I don't know what to call you. I don't know if you are new old media or old new media or medium media, but you're basically definitely part of the establishment. I mean, you now have actually produced an editor of a magazine who was a staffer at Slate, the editor of the New Republic, came from Slate. You're hiring people like John Dickerson, who is coming from Time magazine. So you're right, completely in the mix. And that's what's going to be happening more and more. And I mean, we're just a little upstart. We're over just a year old, and people are still amazed that we can walk and we're potty trained. But it's all happening very fast. That's the other thing that's remarkable. It used to take 30 years to create a brand, and 20 years, 10 years. Now you can create a brand in this online world in a year. And that means advertising comes to you much faster. I mean, we thought it was going to be a year before we could take advertising. We started taking advertising after 3 months. We became profitable after 1 year. These things would not have happened 10 years ago.
Right.
Yeah.
So it's all accelerated.
I think that's absolutely true, but I think in answer to your question, you're going to pay yourself to go to New Orleans, but fortunately, because of Malcolm's analogy, it will not be an expensive flight. What will happen 5 years from now is that extraordinary dispatches from the hurricane site will come from people who are there, who are uploading photos on Flickr, who are, if you will, aggregating content on a local blog, and with the help of Google Earth, you'll really be able to know an awful lot without even having to make that trip, and you can probably write your column just sitting at home.
Sir.
Hi. Going back to what Malcolm and Jacob were talking about versus finding websites that can aggregate a lot of information and the irony of being in a library, I would remind Malcolm that they still have pneumatic tubes in the library to pass information, and that it's a lending library, this non-lending library. You can't take the books out, and the hours have been cut back because of New York City budget. So where Jacob can read that aggregate information anywhere in the world at any time, at any moment, libraries don't do that. And going back to what Norman's talking about, which I think was the point of the panel discussion, is planes might be a losing industry, but I think that people take planes because they get to places faster, just like there are many places people would probably still prefer to take horse-drawn carriages across the country, but it takes a little bit too long. So my question is these carrier systems that allow us to get things more easily, more readily, as the cycle of the information has changed, that as much as we'd like newspapers to exist in the future, that the economic models that Norman keep coming back to, and the way that we all intake our information, is it just quaint to think that they will be back here 50 years from today? Are those two pressures too great to withstand that?
I think the newspapers that learn to adopt and the magazines that learn to adopt and incorporate the new technology, the new way of doing content, are going to survive and thrive. I mean, let me give you an example that brought this whole thing home to me. Last July, do you remember, there were two events that happened in London within the space of 48 hours. One is that London got the Olympics for 2012, and the other is the bombing in the subway. And I remember waking up and reading my New York Times and seeing on the cover a picture of jubilant Londoners celebrating the awarding of the Olympics, while on CNN we had scenes from the devastation in the subway, and while on the Huffington Post we had some of our London bloggers blogging about what was happening, we had pictures of what was happening, and these were like the three ways to get information. And if the New York Times doesn't have a really thriving online operation to update what's happening in print, then it's not going to survive. But it's not difficult to have that online operation if you can get people with the right mindset to produce the right content and drive massive advertising to it.
I mean, I hope to be around to be proven wrong, but 50 years from now, I don't think the print version of the New York Times is going to be a big deal. I hope and would predict that the New York Times will be a thriving institution, but I don't think there are going to be a lot of people turning the pages. You know, the question that Mike asked, whenever I'm around a group of college students, I do the same survey, and I say, how many of you read the New York Times online? And if it's a group of journalism students or a group in New York, just about every hand goes up. And then I say, how many of you read the print newspaper? And either 0 hands go up out of a group of 20 or 30 or 40, or maybe 1 or 2. And surveys that are done say that not only did these people of this age, who are very politically engaged and involved, do not read a print newspaper, they do not expect to ever read a print newspaper. They're very comfortable reading things on a screen. Maybe they print things out from time to time. But they are just not going to become print newspaper readers. But it doesn't matter. I mean, what matters is that what the New York Times does, it's a service to everyone, bloggers, people who are citizens of the country.
And the Washington Post.
Yes, I didn't want to favor the home team. But the New York Times is a proxy for a high-quality national newspaper, and one that happens to be read fairly heavily in this room, I would wager. That has to survive. But the print form, it doesn't really matter.
Paul has given me a dispensation as a library employee to offer a rebuttal in defense of libraries. And both to Jacob Weisberg and also to the man who asked the previous question. First of all, I'd like to remind everybody that you can visit www.nypl.org 24 hours a day. We have a myriad of online resources available free, which the last I checked was not the case at Amazon. We're digitizing an enormous quantity of our books with Google, as many of you know from having come to a program here about it. We also, and this I think is really key, aside from reaching 18 million people yearly, our branch library system, which is a lending system, offers internet access to people who might want to read Slate who actually may not have other ways to do so. That's one thing you all haven't talked about, which is a lot of people don't have computers. and I think internet access, both in this very building and at a network of more than 80 branches across the city, and then the also Brooklyn system in Queens, reaching only the 5 boroughs. Without us, I think your readership might be really diminished. So thank you.
On that note, I think that we have to stop. All right, go ahead.
I have a question for Ariana. You said you're going to hire investigative journalists. Does the New York Times has, I believe, 1,200 editors, not all of them investigative, but quite a few. It has a bureau in Baghdad with, I think, 2,000 people, which costs $5 million a month, at least. When are you going to reach that? And up to this point, aren't you kind of a parasite on the body of the New York Times and the Washington Post?
See, we got back to anatomy after all.
Yeah.
Actually, what is very interesting is that despite all these phenomenal resources the New York Times has, it got the lead up to the war completely wrong. And it is partly responsible for the fact that we are in an unnecessary war. It bears a huge responsibility for
But Ariana...
No, this is very important, because there it is. It had all these massive resources, and it allowed stories like the aluminum tube story that Judy Miller wrote to appear on the front page, above the fold, on a Sunday, when there was an enormous amount of information contradicting her research and her sources. And it was not published, and that's the problem fundamentally with newspapers like that, where basically, in order to gain access, journalists sell their journalistic soul, and I hope we'll do a much better job online.
But Ariana, as a citizen in a democracy, considering going to war, would you really want to depend on bloggers to supply the information that you needed to reach an intelligent conclusion?
Do you really seriously think that the New York Times did a better job than bloggers would have done? If you look at the report...
Well, what do you mean would have done? Bloggers
what
were
I'm
there.
saying is that I'm talking about looking forward. If we had these resources, and if there were multiple sources of information, as opposed to a newspaper of record that people relied on, that this administration used and manipulated. On that same Sunday, you had Dick Cheney and Rumsfeld and Condi Rice out there on all the Sunday shows saying, the New York Times is saying that. This was the same information they had fed to the New York Times. This is an absolute atrocity. When the history of this war is written, the New York Times will have a huge responsibility for what happened. And so remember that when you praise the enormous resources of this huge institution that let this country and the public down when it came to a matter of war and peace.
So you've stopped reading the New York Times.
Of course I haven't stopped reading it, Michael.
Well, you can't trust it. It got this thing
but that's why I
wrong.
trust a lot of people who are criticizing what appears in the New York Times as it appears again and again. And holding the mainstream media's feet to the fire is one of the great jobs the blogosphere is doing. Not just the New York Times and Judy Miller, and Jack Schaefer of Slate did a terrific job of analyzing exactly all the ways in which this reporting was absolutely atrocious and should never have been allowed, infinitely worse than what Jason Blair did. What Jason Blair did is nothing compared to what they did. And so that's something to remember and to weigh against what the online community is doing.
Well, the
weapons of mass destruction story was basically not debunked by the blogosphere. It was debunked by basically British papers, by the BBC and by The Guardian, and the blogosphere in the United States came after these people.
Well, you should Norm gets the last word.
Well, I was just going to say that the issue really about the walk up to the war in Iraq wasn't so much what the New York Times was doing as that you hadn't started business yet.
And none of this would have happened if Huffington Post
would not be in Iraq, yes.
So
if the Huffington Post had been in business, we wouldn't be in Iraq, right?
Thanks, Paul. Well, all right, we'll take another 2 questions. Sir.
You guys have talked a lot about the future of institutions, but I'm kind of wondering about the future of content a little bit. You touched on how different the tone of political writing or of dialogue is on new blog media versus the old broadsheet media. And I'm kind of wondering now that you guys are all becoming, Ariana and Kinsley and Slate are all becoming more mainstream, what is the future of the conversation going to be? Is it going to be the kind of slightly New Yorker tone of kind of snarkiness and humor and personality? Or is it going to be more of a broadsheet and more of Miss Huffington style of very poised and informative and kind of a little more furrow-browed content. Just kind of wondering, what do you think the place of humor and personality is in a proper political dialogue or in a proper information dialogue?
Well, it's very necessary for us. I mean, it's sort of what makes the medicine go down, and it's kind of built in. I mean, I think it's, you know, we don't, in Slate, we don't run a lot of humor pieces labeled as humor pieces. We run some, but we like a certain tone of humor to infuse almost everything we do. It's, you know, one of the lessons we learned from our founder, Michael Kinsley, that you can write about, you know, pretty dry policy, but if you write about it in the right way and are entertaining, you can get people to read it. But, you know, this draws together, I think, your point a little bit and what was being talked about a minute ago. You know, I mean, we're in a funny position because from the point of view of bloggers, we're the mainstream media, and from the point of view of mainstream media, we're a bit of a blog. But one of the wonderful things about what's happened on the internet, from my point of view, is it's broken down the barriers to entry in journalism. And that is threatening to a lot of traditional journalists who think, well, you know, weren't we a real profession? How can anybody do it? But it does create this kind of rough meritocracy. And Slate has hired people who wrote blogs that we saw. You know, people have emerged out of the Fray, which is our reader bulletin board, as writers for different publications. And what it means is that, you know, in the old days, when I went into journalism, it was sort of hard to get into journalism. I mean, if you didn't go to the right school, or you didn't have good connections, or you couldn't get a good first job, you know, having talent, being a talented writer, having an eye, being a good reporter, wasn't necessarily enough. And because of the internet, sort of anybody can do it. And, you know, and if you're good, you can do it on your own, and you do have to find some way to support yourself or pay for it. But if you do it and attract a little audience and attract a little attention, suddenly you can be a journalist too.
It's a little easier to do it when you've got Microsoft behind you. I mean, you should concede.
But also this year we had something very interesting that we were all part of, which is what happened to Bob Woodward. I mean, that was the ultimate, the gold standard of journalism, being exposed for the way he handled Planegate, for the fact that when he had this unlimited access in the lead up to the war, he wrote books that were full of little detail but missed the big story. So whom are we holding up as the ultimate in journalism? I mean, the people who gave us Watergate, the people who exposed what the corruption of power, were now becoming corrupted themselves because of the access that they were gaining, the huge book contracts they were getting. So there was a tremendous need for alternative source of information, for ways to hold them accountable. And it's not, again, either or. We're not going to displace anybody, but I hope we're going to make the mainstream media better, and that we're going to keep getting better and better ourselves in the way.
Yeah, but now the blogsters are getting the fat book contracts and going on TV and everything, and is that going to corrupt you?
Absolutely, and that's always going to be a problem. You know, that now that, I mean, I was at the blogger convention in Las Vegas, and you had presidential contenders for 2008 seducing bloggers, you know, not literally, but, you know, Mark Warner was throwing a party that cost $90,000. And I said to him, wow. I said, a lot of these people never get out of their house. I said, you are throwing this huge party. He said to me, well, I wouldn't have hesitated throwing a party like that for elected officials or big donors, where bloggers are now becoming more and more influential in the political process. So sure, could they be co-opted? Absolutely. We have to guard against that all the time.
Last question, sir.
It's actually a question for Arianna. Don't you think it's actually a little bit...
Hi, Nick. This is Nick Denton, the Rupert Murdoch of the blogosphere.
I was actually going to say that, I mean, you do a great job of touting the virtues of the blogosphere. But isn't it maybe a little bit time, given the success so far, for a bit of self-criticism? That one of the things that I remarked upon when you were talking about the value and the importance of links, how the Times Select was such a disaster in that regard. Sometimes when I look at what we do, we look at stats the whole time. I think, Jacob, we've talked about this before. We look at stats the whole time, which stories are most popular. You probably look at the Huffington Post to see which things get commented upon most. Don't you think that sometimes puts us in the position of whoring for clicks, of going for the easy story the whole time, going for what's going to get the biggest response from our more rabid readers?
Well, I mean, Nick, you're absolutely right that we have to guard against that. I mean, we all get the reports every night of which blogs got the most traffic, which were emailed the most. And to write about things that we care about, that we are passionate about, is ultimately the best way to succeed. I have no doubt about that. There is something about the online community that really recognizes authenticity, passion, and real engagement in what you are writing. And if you're not really engaged, it shows. And you may get clicks at the beginning, but it's not long lasting. And you know that. That's why you have so many great properties online, and more to come, I have no doubt.
Well, on that non-commercial note, we'll reassemble in 10 years, possibly not in...
We'll invite you back before 10 years.
Well, we may not need you in 10 years.
I'd like to invite you. You know, the story tonight about who reads books before reviewing them reminds me of a moment in time when I was teaching at a very famed institution with some pusillanimous students, but still good students at Williams College. And I had a student there who always said very interesting things, but mostly wrong. And one day we were reading Bartleby the Scrivener, and Michael talked. And I said, that's really interesting, but Michael, tell me something. Have you in fact read Bartleby the Scrivener? And he said, not personally. Anyway, thank you very much. Instigated that conversation, and I hope in that role of instigator, hopefully not too much as a moderator, we have the excellent Michael Kinsley for this Slate debate, which this evening is co-sponsored by Slate itself and its excellent director, editor Jacob Weisberg. What a year this has been indeed. My first 504 days in New York City, and here at the New York Public Library we had Myra Kalman last year, and John Hope Franklin with President Clinton, and I had the pleasure of interviewing David Remnick a couple of weeks ago, Jonathan Miller and Rebecca Solnit talking about the notion of attention span. How do we have an attention span, which I think is not irrelevant for the conversation tonight. A debate about Google with the various people who now are suing each other. They were quite civil here at the library. We hosted a pen event with Amartya Sen, several events, and Salman Rushdie. An evening on revolution moderated by Christopher Hitchens, who sometimes writes for Slate. And the same Hitchens has been actually very helpful to me, because I had the pleasure of welcoming here Tina Brown interviewing Bernard-Henri Lévy, and as you might remember, Garrison Keillor gave Bernard-Henri Lévy what I would call a not very kind review. But the Homer of Middle America, as Christopher Hitchens named Garrison Keillor, came to the rescue. In the pages of Slate, the article was wonderfully entitled Garrison.
He was a reporter for the Washington Times, and we all assumed he must be a Moonie. And now, of course, he is Reverend Moon to a large part of the American business establishment. So we're very glad to have him here. I've known Ariana since she was a liberal the last time. And she has had many accomplishments, written many books. I somehow think these books might be about you, or at least I was working on that theory. The Making of a Legend, Creator and Destroyer, but then I looked at the others and decided that theory doesn't work. I think Ariana has done a fabulous job, miraculous really, in establishing the Huffington Post as not just a major website, but a major force in the media in this country in barely a year. And a small sign of that success was last week, I think. The New York Times had an article about some arrangement between you and the New York Observer, and the peg was, big, powerful website helps small, insignificant website. And Ariana was the big, powerful website. Jacob is editor of Slate. There's only 2 people who have had that job, and he's had it more recently. He had a very good idea in the current Slate. He had
evening. Welcome.
Thanks. Thanks, Paul. Well, we're very fortunate to have here 4 experts on the human anatomy to continue the library's discussion of that topic, and maybe we'll segue into Slate if we can. It was 11 years ago, actually, or approaching it, when I went out to Redmond, Washington to talk to Microsoft about starting an online magazine. And I left there with many dreams of glory, of millions of readers, of putting Time magazine and Newsweek out of business. But I certainly never dreamed that in just 10 years, we'd have a symposium at the New York Public Library. So I think this is our greatest accomplishment to date, and Jacob deserves congratulations. You all know these panelists. I'm just going to say a word or two about them because I think I know them better than some people here. If you'd asked anyone in the circle of the New Republic, say 20 years ago, who in that crowd was most likely to become a revered and fabulously wealthy guru for businessmen all over the world, you would have obviously said Malcolm. and that is because, little known, it says here that he's a staff writer with the New Yorker and he was a reporter for the Washington Post. Before that,
Good evening. My name is Paul Holdengraber, and I'm the Director of Public Programs here at the New York Public Library, now known as Live from the New York Public Library. As you all know, my goal here at the library is to make the lions roar. Last night with Mario Batali, Bill Buford, and Anthony Bourdain, they were feasting, and I hope tonight they will be debating. Tonight is the grand finale of our season, the third event co-sponsored with the Cullman Center for Scholars and Writers here at the New York Public Library and its excellent director, Gene Strauss. We've done 3 events with them. The first one, I had the pleasure of interviewing Edmund White, who wrote a wonderful memoir. Quite interested he is in the human anatomy, particularly in the male anatomy, particularly in a small part of the male anatomy. And I had great pleasure asking Edmund White if his book is a book that one reads with one hand. Afterwards, this was one of the very few moments where he seemed bashful. After that, we did an event on eavesdropping with James Risen, the head also of the NSA, Bobby Ray Inman, Jeffrey Rosen, and Patrick Keefe, the very day that Michael Hayden had been suggested for that job, and Jeffrey Rosen very aptly Keeler vulgarian. I highly recommend that you join our email list. You will then learn of the events we're doing next year. They're on your chair also. If you join today, you will be able to get 2 free tickets. I'm happy to say that our email list expanded from a few hundred now to a little over 10,000. Become a friend of the library, support this library. It's one of the last beacons of democracy. Books of the first 10 years of Slate, not every single piece written, but a few of the pieces written, will be on sale after the event. I recommend also that when you ask a question and require an answer, you go to the 2 mics. And in 10 years of doing this, I've come to an understanding that a question is usually something that can be asked in about 54 to 57 seconds. So I highly recommend you ask questions rather than make statements. So I hope for this not too chummy debate, we will have a wonderful time here tonight debating the issue of online media and print journalism. We have Norman Pearlstein, Jacob Weisberg, Michael Kinsley, Ariana Huffington, who I know from my days in blessed Los Angeles, and Malcolm Gladwell, who has said about Slate, I don't think I've ever gone to Slate and not been fascinated, infuriated, or simply found myself laughing out loud. So let's see how we react tonight to this